Good afternoon. Very fine afternoon in lovely Geneva. I really want to thank you all who are here and also welcome the audience in their offices and homes, who I think are the majority of the audience that's joining us today. I always enjoy being in Geneva. I find it to be one of the cities in the world that calms me down, reminds me of a beautiful lake, and it's very calming until you go to the restaurant and then they bring the bill to you. That's when you have time to ponder the professional choices you've made. But it's great being here. We're here today to undertake a very serious task of launching a report that I think is going to have a meaningful impact on the world. And as somebody who has had this job of executive director of the Center on International Cooperation for less than a month, one of the questions has been, as I've changed, is what am I to expect? After 12 years in government, after working in counterterrorism and diplomacy, what can I expect from the world of research and the world of civil society? And it is tremendously rewarding to be here, to be part of a launch of a report that I think is going to make a big difference in people's lives. And that's going, at least convinces me that this new opportunity that I have been blessed to have is off to a flying start in terms of the impact we can have. And that is thanks to the task force on having global violence and this report that it has produced. The first meeting of the task force took place in 2021, and we have with us the co-chairs of that task force. We have Her Excellency Irène Esambo Diata, who is the Minister in charge of people with disabilities and other vulnerable people of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we have, from here in Switzerland, Ambassador Dominik Stillhart, who's the Deputy Director of the Swiss Agency for Development. And we have, not joining us today, we have Dr. Mohammed Chambers, who's a high-level representative on silencing the gangs initiative of the African Union. He was supposed to be here with us and was looking forward to it, but his duties on the Sudan crisis have made it impossible, but he looks forward to continuing his commitment and work with the task force. Another of the leaders of this task force is Dr. Vasu Gundan, the Executive Director of Accord, who we were just with on a call about an hour ago. He is in Durban. He has a health issue that does not enable him to travel, but he similarly is committed to the next steps we're going to be taking. So Minister Esambo, Ambassador Stillhart, thank you so much for your commitment and also being here today. What this report reflects, and you will hear more about its findings, is original research on the costs of violence, its prevalence, and how it manifests. And we at CIC manage the Gender Equality Network for Small Arms Control, which works with our grassroots and high-level members across the world to advance life-saving policies and activities in precisely this environment of how to reduce violence in our communities. We also co-facilitate the Peace in Our Cities network that works in partnership with mayors, civil society, and local officials. And that combined with the work of the Gender and Small Arms Program has, alongside the cities and other civil society partners, has contributed in the cities that we undertake that work for reductions of local violence by up to 60%. Astonishing results that are born of partnership and collaboration. So we bring that history, the leadership of the task force, the research undertaken to bring it all together to this report, beyond the battlefields, practical strategies to having global violence in our homes, streets, and communities. And I really want to appreciate the members of the task force for the work that they have done. Those of you who are part of the debates that are going on here within the United Nations, within the different multilateral spaces, as I was in New York until a few weeks ago, know that the common feeling is one of frustration and a sense of multilateralism struggling ever more to deliver tangible good to people, and a growing distance between our citizens and multilateral institutions. We all want to do well, but when we come together as delegations, we have a hard time agreeing. So it is so promising to be able to stand here today to talk about an initiative that can take international cooperation and purpose it to deliver safety and security to people who are suffering the silent scourge of interpersonal and criminal violence. It wouldn't be possible without the Swiss government, which has given us long-standing support and commitment to the Pathfinders Initiative and this Halving Global Violence Task Force. Thank you to Switzerland for that kind of commitment. Also, thank you to the Small Arms Survey for their role as co-organizers of this event. And of course, we do this with you who are here, who are part of the Geneva Peace community, that in fact, in many ways, is the world's leading ecosystem thinking about peace and human rights. And it means that we are from New York, not peaceful New York and almost as expensive as Geneva, are here to be able to bridge what Geneva and New York can do together. I've just mentioned that Dr. Chambers is engaged on the ongoing emergency in Sudan. So it's just to pause and mention, not because that's what we're here to discuss today, that as we're discussing this report and what we're going to do, we have to remember the profound humanitarian and political and security emergency that is underway in Sudan, not to mention several other important crises around the world. Those crises are so difficult to solve. The conflicts are so entrenched. The interests appear so irreconcilable. Whether it's the war in Europe, that was launched by the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, or the conflict now raging in the Middle East, with its immense humanitarian and security costs, or indeed the world's greatest humanitarian emergency in Sudan. Yeah. Massive crisis. Amazingly, even as we are unable to make headway in those, violence is all around us, not just in those 3 countries that I've mentioned. It turns out, as you all know, violence is universal. All countries, regardless of their region, ethnic composition, levels of economic development, levels of governmental competence, all dealing with the burdens of violence. And it turns out that the majority of violence that people experience is not suffered in those war zones that I have just mentioned. It's in our homes. It's in our communities. It turns out from the research that has been undertaken and is reflected in this report that that violence is immensely costly. Beyond just a moral imperative to reach out, to give assistance, support, and empowerment to those who are victims of that violence and reduce it, we also have an economic incentive to do so. From the richest countries to the poorest countries, our citizens are demanding higher income, more shared income, more prosperity. And the violence in our homes and in our communities is directly undermining our promise to our citizens to deliver greater prosperity. Our public health systems, our insurance systems are having to pay such high costs to respond to the violence in our homes. Whether it's an angry spouse with a handgun or another form of violence, it stretches our entire system in ways that are so costly, and that I think this report begins to table as it looks at the violence in using 3 case studies that you shall hear more about. This is not just to mention a massive problem that perhaps can even be thought of in public health terms. It's not to admire the problem. In New York, in the UN, we love admiring problems. We just walk around them. We admire the enormity of the problem, its shape, its smell, its color. And then we walk off and say, wow, that's a huge, huge problem. But something can be done about it. A lot of this violence in our homes and communities is preventable. Success is possible. We can cut it in half or more. And all around the world, we have seen examples of initiatives already in place that have obtained measurable progress to reduce that violence. Halving global violence by 2030 is ambitious, but we have to do it. For all those children, the men, all those people today who are under assault in their very homes, we have an obligation to reach out and do what we can in the most practical ways we can. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of my introductory remarks. And you will now hear from colleagues who know a lot more than I do about this report. And we shall have a presentation of the key messages and findings of the task force. We shall then take a little break, and then we shall have a Davos-style expert panel discussion. And by Davos-style, none of the participants will be as rich as the Davos-style panel discussants, but they'll be as informed, if not more so. And I shall have the honor of moderating that session, and then we'll have an open discussion, Q&A with panelists. So I want to ask you, as you listen to the submissions by Daniel Friedman, who's a program director of the Halving Global Violence at CIC, and listen to the keynote speeches that are coming up now, to please ponder what are the practical applications that we can make, that we can undertake, that you can undertake. Can we partner with you? Can we work together? What can we do with this task force? What are the next steps forward? Please think about it, because our door is open to listening and acting. I'd like now to welcome Ambassador Dominik Stillhart, Deputy Director, Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. I only met him a few days ago in Bern, but in that short time, I have been struck by his passion for the job, his level of practicality. And of course, this is not surprising, because for many years, he was in the humanitarian response, and humanitarians are focused foremost on that. So, Dominik, you have the floor.
Ambassador Kimani, Minister Esambo Diallo, dear guests here in the room, dear everyone else who is joining us from around the world online, it is a great pleasure to be here with you today for the launch of this flagship report on halving global violence. There is perhaps no other city in the world that has such a calming effect on people, and where its history is also so closely intertwined with the history of peace itself as Geneva. It is therefore really fitting that we are here today to launch this flagship report on halving global violence. The UN 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda recognizes that peace and development are intrinsically linked. It further acknowledges that attaining peace requires that we significantly reduce all forms of violence. That means not just addressing the violence that captures the headlines, like the ones that you mentioned, Ambassador Kimani, Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, although one can debate how much Sudan actually captures headlines. But the often overlooked violence that is happening in our streets and in our homes, or as somebody in our meeting this morning said, the meeting of the task force, the silent form of violence. Violence reduction is indeed a cornerstone of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, and the SDG 16 directly calls on the reduction of all forms of violence, and 13 other targets also refer to it, recognizing the very fact that violence must be prevented and reduced wherever it exists. Switzerland is committed to all SDGs and in particular SDG 16. That is why from the very inception we decided to support the Pathfinder Initiative for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies. Together actually with two other states at the beginning, Sierra Leone and Brazil, and I'm proud to say that by now 46 member states are engaged in this initiative. Switzerland has taken a particular interest in the Halving Global Violence Task Force, proudly serving as one of its co-chairs and providing guidance and support to this esteemed group of global leaders and experts that are all committed to advancing the implementation of the SDG targets for peace. In recognition that violence is a universal issue, and Ambassador Kimani, you also referred to that, and that even countries deemed as peaceful, such as Switzerland, do suffer the effects of violence within their own borders. Switzerland therefore welcomed the Pathfinders initiative to assess the cost of violence in our own country, and the study produced stunning results. Actually, it concluded that violence in Switzerland costs the equivalent of more than 8% of our country's GDP, and that many of these costs are actually associated with domestic violence. 8% of our GDP, that is the cost of violence in Switzerland, according to the report that is mentioned here in the flagship report. This knowledge is crucial to take effective action and to curb violence. Switzerland has already taken significant steps that are needed to reduce domestic violence. As a signatory of the Istanbul Convention, we strive to implement the convention, which includes early involvement of all levels of authority, the adoption of a national action plan, and improving the care and protection, particularly of women victims of violence. The study carried out in Switzerland, Costa Rica, and South Africa, again, you can all read this in the report. These studies not only provided very valuable insights for each of the countries where to focus efforts, but also fostered an exchange of experience and a range of findings useful to draw lessons on the root causes of violence and ideas to address these root causes. We are therefore very pleased to see our years of hard work reflected in this report, including the tangible and practical recommendations that we can all put to use as we seek to fulfill our commitment to cutting violence in half. The next task, and we had a long discussion this morning, the next task is now to put the findings into action. And in a way, we have now arrived at a very critical juncture. We have a report, we have clear evidence that violence, and not the type of political violence that we all think about, but domestic violence, the violence that takes place in our streets, has a significant cost, including in countries that are deemed to be peaceful. We also have a number of avenues that are mentioned in this report, how this violence can be addressed. There are wonderful examples that we had the opportunity to discuss in Durban in autumn last year, from South Africa, from the Democratic Republic of Congo, from a whole range of countries, how to curb the type of silent violence that we are talking about today. So what we would like this to be about today is really celebrating the report, noticing the results, but also have a conversation how to take this forward, how to make sure that this report is not just another nice report that we then have in our shelves, but a report that is going to spur us into action in order to reduce the type of violence we are talking about for a more inclusive and just and peaceful society. I'm looking forward very much to the keynote speech also of the Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Thank you very much for joining us in Geneva. And of course, I'm looking forward to the discussions on the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those remarks. I really have a great privilege to welcome Her Excellency Irène Esambo Diata, Minister in charge of people with disabilities and other vulnerabilities of the DRC. Honorable Minister is a trailblazer. She is a human rights lawyer of note, a human rights lawyer who is registered with the International Criminal Court since 1913. She is DRC's first minister for people with disabilities, and now works, as I said, as a minister who's delegated to the Ministry of Social Affairs. And she comes from a country that I know of holds the fate of the region my country, Kenya, is in. Their prosperity, their security will transform the world. And nashukuru sana umekuja Geneva. Nashukuru hiyo kazi unafanya. Nashukuru tutafanya kazi pamoja. Nakuuliza tafadhali utuambie kitu kidogo.
Merci beaucoup. Excellences, mesdames et messieurs, distingués invités, en vos titres et qualités. Je voudrais commencer mon allocution par vous présenter les salutations de son Excellence, Monsieur Félix Antoine Tshisekedi Tshilombo, président de la République démocratique du Congo, dont l'engagement pour la paix et la non-violence active sont manifestes à travers ses initiatives d'ouverture à la collaboration économique et politique en Afrique et dans le monde, ainsi que son engagement pour la promotion du genre et de la lutte contre la marginalisation des personnes vulnérables, dont les personnes avec handicap.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, I'd like to begin by conveying the greetings of His Excellency Félix Antoine Tshisekedi Tshilombo, the President of the Democratic Republic of Congo, whose commitment to active nonviolence and peace can be seen in his initiatives towards economic and political collaboration in Africa and in the world, and his commitment to gender promotion and the fight against the marginalization of vulnerable persons, including persons with disability.
Comme d'aucuns le savent, la République démocratique du Congo est l'un des pays du continent africain qui fait face à une situation de violence de masse récurrente, particulièrement la violence armée du fait de la multiplicité de groupes armés locaux et étrangers, les cas du M23 soutenu par certains États voisins.
As many know, the Democratic Republic of Congo is one of the countries on the African continent faced with a situation of recurring mass violence, particularly armed violence due to the many armed groups, both local and foreign, such as M23, which is supported by neighboring countries, including Rwanda.
L'impact de ces conflits armés dans la partie est du pays est ressenti sur l'ensemble du territoire national à travers notamment le déplacement massif des populations vers les zones présumées en paix avec comme conséquence, entre autres, la précarité et la promiscuité dans les familles, ainsi que l'augmentation de personnes devenues handicapées du fait de la guerre. Actuellement, la République démocratique du Congo compte plus de 13 millions de personnes ayant un handicap causé par le conflit armé.
The entire country is feeling the impact of the armed conflict in the eastern part of the country, with large numbers of displaced persons moving to areas presumed to be at peace. The result of this is driving poverty and overcrowding in families, and also an increase in the number of people with disabilities caused by war. Currently in the country, there are over 13 million people with a disability caused by armed conflict.
Face à cette réalité, la République démocratique du Congo est heureuse de participer à l'élaboration de cette étude que nous présentons aujourd'hui en tant que co-présidente de ce groupe de travail de haut niveau ayant pour objectif fondamental réduire de moitié la violence globale dans le monde.
So as such, the Democratic Republic of Congo is very pleased to take part in preparing this report as co-chair of the Halving Global Violence Task Force.
Personnellement, je suis fière de faire partie de ces efforts qui aujourd'hui permettent de comprendre non seulement l'impact de la violence dans la société, mais aussi de trouver des mesures réelles et pratiques pour la prévenir et la réduire.
Personally, I'm proud to be part of these efforts, which are shedding light not just on the impacts of violence in society, but also on how to find real practical measures to prevent and reduce it.
Je me réjouis de voir plusieurs de nos recommandations résumées dans ces rapports. À titre illustratif, le rapport renseigne que bien que les hommes soient à la fois victimes et auteurs le plus courant de la violence, cela va bien au-delà d'une question d'hommes tuant les hommes, car les conséquences de la violence affectent aussi d'autres catégories sociales. Ainsi, il se dégage que pour chaque homicide, il y a des milliers de cas d'agression. En outre, plus d'1 milliard d'enfants restent exposés aux violences au cours de leur vie, tandis qu'un tiers des femmes subiront des violences de la part d'un partenaire intime et des milliers de personnes deviendront handicapées à cause des actes de violence.
I am pleased to see many of our recommendations in this report. One illustration is that the report explains that although men are the most frequent victims and perpetrators of violence, this goes way beyond a matter of men killing men. The consequences of violence affect also other categories in society. For every homicide, there are thousands of cases of assault. In addition, 1 billion children remain exposed to violence in their lifetimes, and 1/3 of women will suffer intimate partner violence, and thousands of people will suffer disabilities due to acts of violence.
La violence affecte différemment les hommes et les femmes dans nos sociétés, alors que les hommes sont plus à risque dans la rue, les femmes sont plus en danger chez elles à la maison. Plus de la moitié des cas de féminicide analysés dans notre étude sont commis par des partenaires intimes ou des membres de famille, contre seulement 11% des cas d'homicide où la victime est un homme.
Violence affects women and men differently in our societies. Men are more at risk in the street, while women are more in danger in their homes. More than half of femicides analyzed by our study were committed by an intimate partner or member of the family, compared to just 11% of homicides committed against a man.
Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, parce que les armes à feu sont à l'origine d'une grande partie de ces violences et que la violence affecte différemment les hommes et les femmes, je suis fière de faire partie d'une autre initiative de Pathfind, les réseaux pour l'égalité des genres et le contrôle des armes légères, G5 en sigle. G5 est composé de plus de 100 membres issus du gouvernement et de la société civile locale, œuvrant pour la réduction de la violence en abordant les liens entre le genre et les armes légères.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, because firearms are the cause of a large share of violence, and violence affects women and men differently, I'm proud to be part of another Pathfinders initiative, the Gender Equality Network for Small Arms Control, or GENSAC. GENSAC is made up of 100 members from governments and local civil society working to reduce violence by addressing the links between gender and small arms.
Par exemple, nous avons constaté dans notre rapport que pour prévenir et réduire la violence, il faut s'attaquer à ses causes profondes. Pour ce faire, le changement des normes et des perceptions concernant les genres devient plus qu'une nécessité pour lutter contre certaines antivaleurs, notamment les notions de masculinité militarisée et celles qui font l'éloge de la dureté, de la force et de la domination physique dans la construction de nos sociétés, en ciblant les femmes et les autres personnes vulnérables comme les êtres inférieurs.
For example, the report points to the need to prevent and reduce violence by addressing its deep causes. Changing gender norms and perceptions is therefore crucial if we're to fight against certain anti-values, such as militarized masculinity and those that praise toughness, strength, and physical domination by targeting women and other vulnerable persons as inferior.
À ce sujet, il y a un exemple de programme de prévention du recrutement très réussi sorti de la République démocratique du Congo. Il s'agit de clubs de jeunes hommes contre la violence mis en œuvre dans le cadre du partenariat entre l'Institut Living Peace et Promudo qui travaille sur la fourniture aux jeunes hommes de modes de vie alternatifs à l'adhésion aux gangs locaux et sur le travail communautaire pour changer les normes autour de la masculinité et montrer des expressions non violentes alternatives de la virilité.
We have a very successful example from the Democratic Republic of Congo of a program to prevent gang recruitment. These are the Young Men's Clubs Against Violence, which have been set up in partnership with the Living Peace Institute and Promundo, working to provide young men with alternatives to joining gangs and also to promote community work in order to change norms around masculinity and to model alternatives that are non-violent expressions of virility.
Au niveau du gouvernement congolais, il y a actuellement une initiative positive à travers les services nationaux dénommée Formation des bâtisseurs, visant la formation de jeunes délinquants dans l'apprentissage de métiers dans plusieurs secteurs, dont l'agriculture et la menuiserie, afin de le rendre utile à la nation et leur redonner un avenir louable.
The Congolese government has taken initiative as part of its national service, where it is training, it's called training of builders, to train young offenders as apprentices in sectors like agriculture and carpentry, so that they can serve the nation and also to offer them a positive future.
La création en République démocratique du Congo d'un ministère gouvernemental dédié aux personnes avec handicap et autres personnes vulnérables répond également du besoin de lutter contre les violences interpersonnelles qui affectent ces catégories sociales du fait de leur marginalisation en famille et dans la société. Il nous faut un monde plus accessible et plus inclusif pour assurer la paix et la sécurité à tout le monde sans exception.
The Democratic Republic of Congo established a ministry dedicated to people with disabilities and other vulnerable people. This was also done to address the need to tackle interpersonal violence, which affects these social categories because they are marginalized within their families and society. We need a world that is more accessible and more inclusive in order to guarantee peace and security for all without exception.
Comme documenté dans le rapport et grâce à mon expérience directe avec GENSAC, le parti prenante à tous les niveaux peuvent et doivent jouer un rôle actif dans les efforts de prévention et de réduction de la violence interpersonnelle.
As the report shows, and also as I've seen in my own direct experience with GENSAC, stakeholders at all levels must and can and must play an active role in prevention and reduction of interpersonal violence.
Les initiatives les plus réussies sont celles qui travaillent de manière holistique et intersectorielle et qui incluent les initiatives de réduction de la violence dans le cadre des stratégies plus larges de développement social. Cela signifie que le programme fonctionne mieux lorsqu'ils incluent une combinaison de gouvernements nationaux et locaux, d'organisations internationales et régionales de la société civile et du secteur privé, ainsi que d'autres acteurs.
The most successful initiatives are those that are holistic and intersectoral. That means including violence reduction initiatives as part of broader social development strategies. These programs work best when they include a combination of local and national government, international organizations and regional ones, civil society, the private sector, and others.
Pour terminer, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, grâce à mon rôle au sein du gouvernement de la République démocratique du Congo, en tant que coprésidente du groupe de travail pour réduire de la moitié la violence globale et en tant que membre actif de GENSAC, j'ai hâte de travailler avec vous tous pour mettre ces idées en pratique et rendre opérationnelles toutes les informations qui sont contenues dans notre rapport. Je vous remercie.
So to conclude, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thanks to my role in the government of the DRC as co-chair of the Halving Global Violence Task Force and as an active member of GENSAC, I look forward to working with you all to put these ideas in the report into practice and make them operational. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your remark. I'd like to introduce and welcome two individuals who are my newest colleagues. Daniel Friedman is a program director for Halving Global Violence. Before he was at CIC, he worked for a significant amount of time in the US government, and especially in the State Department's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization. He was a managing director at the Inter-American Foundation, and he spent some time on the Hill as a foreign policy fellow in the Senate. And in the short time I've known him, is one of the hardest working people I've met in quite a while. He will be joined by Luisa Portugal, who's a program officer. She worked before at the IRC. She's a constitutional lawyer, trained in Brazil and in New York. And I think the two of them, for the amount of work that they do, really do get a lot achieved. And so they will walk us through some of the findings and reports for a few minutes and then open up to our Davos-style discussion.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And as mentioned, I work with both the Pathfinders Initiative and housed at the Center on International Cooperation at NYU. And our team is pleased to serve as the Secretariat for the Halving Global Violence Task Force. And before beginning, I just want to take a moment again to thank all of you for joining us today, both in person and virtually, for what we hope will be an excellent discussion. And special thanks again to our host from the Swiss government for their support for our work, as well as to the Small Arms Survey, which we're pleased to count as members of the task force, and both of whom helped to organize today's lunch. And of course, just to repeat our thanks to our task force co-chairs, including Madame Esambo here with us today, those that are joining online, and all the work that's gone in over the years that really culminated with this report. The task force is formed around a simple idea, that violence can indeed be prevented and that drastic reductions in violence are possible. Having global violence is more than a name or a talking point. We do believe that it is an achievable goal. Since our launch, we've worked towards this by bringing together a coalition of leaders from the highest levels of government, from civil society, and academia committed to leveraging their knowledge, expertise, and networks to better understand violence and to identify and share evidence-based solutions to reduce it. One of the main motivations behind the task force is to bring together communities of practice, break down silos between them. We believe that violence reduction depends on exploring the interconnectedness between different fields of practice. Over the last 3 years, the task force has regularly gathered to produce original research on the prevalence, the manifestation, and the costs of violence, to identify what actually works to prevent and reduce it, to compare challenges and share lessons, and build a body of recommendations that can help people at every level and across sectors to achieve our common goal. Our work is also informed by the Gender Equality Network for Small Arms Control, or GENSAC, which you've heard referenced today and which Pathfinders is proud to manage, as well as the Peace in Our Cities Network, which we co-facilitate and together seek to achieve tangible impacts in the area of gender equality, small arms control, and urban violence, respectively. And of course, our efforts are similarly informed by the life-saving work of our task force members, our partners, and so many of you joining us today, and what you're doing on a daily basis. This body of work has been compiled into our flagship report, Beyond the Battlefields, Practical Strategies to Having Global Violence in Our Homes, Streets, and Communities, which we're just thrilled to be launching today. So I'm going to try to be brief, and I don't want to take away anyone's incentive to actually read the report by going into too much detail now, but I'd like to give you an overview of some of our main findings. Some of these may seem obvious, but nonetheless, we believe they are too often overlooked. Firstly, the report highlights that violence is truly a universal challenge. It isn't an issue exclusive to certain countries or regions. Countries that score high on the Human Development Index have a homicide rate equivalent to more than 2/3 of that score lower on the index. Even in countries considered to be at peace, violence is often pervasive and costly, as you've heard mentioned from our co-chairs. Similarly, the report underscores that the vast majority of violence happens outside of conflict. Over the past decade, between 80 to 90% of all violent deaths happen outside of battlefields. And intentional homicides are responsible for almost 4 times as many deaths as war and terrorism combined. Over the past 2 years, we've seen an alarming spike in conflict-related deaths, which almost doubled from 2021 to 2022. However, initial estimates show that violence outside of conflict is still responsible for around 60% of violent deaths, even with this upsurge. I want to take a moment to acknowledge our partners at Small Arms Survey for their Global Violent Deaths Database, as well as from UNODC, who are also doing incredible work to help collect data in their databases, and the accessible information that you provide help to inform these findings on the breakdown and prevalence of violence that we feature in the report. And it's because of this prevalence of interpersonal violence, or the violence that takes place outside of war and conflict, that this has been the primary focus of the task force and of our report. To be clear, we are by no means saying that conflict violence deserves any less attention. However, it's the violence that often fails to make the news headlines but devastates homes and communities worldwide is deserving of greater focus. And as we'll get to in just a moment, interpersonal violence is also notably amenable to change. It's arguably where we've seen the most progress being made. Indeed, we cannot have global violence unless we truly address all forms of violence as called for in the SDGs. And I'd like to turn to my colleague and fellow researcher, Luisa Portugal, who contributed substantially to this report, to go over some of our other key findings.
Thank you, everyone. I'm very happy to be here to review some of our main findings. First, I want to say that yes, violence is universal, but its impacts are not evenly distributed. In certain communities that disproportionately impact are impacted in particularly onerous ways. In particular, I want to talk about the gender component of violence because it needs a close examination. Initial assessment of rates of violence can paint an inaccurate picture of the impact that violence has on women. On top of that, violence that women experience is very different than the violence that men experience and needs to be treated as such. Men are undoubtedly the most common victims of violence, especially when looking at rates of homicide. However, when taking into consideration rates of non-lethal assault and, in particularly, intimate partner violence, we see a much more balanced picture. For women, no place is less safe than their own homes. Over half of all femicides are perpetrated by intimate partners and family members, as we see from the UNODC study, Global Study on Homicides. Nonetheless, women still feel less safe in their communities and streets than men. Threats and coercion can happen even when no shots are fired or no punches are drawn. Usually, levels of violence against women don't follow overall trends of violence. They can remain very high, even when other levels of violence are turning down, or they can be very high in places where other types of violence are low. Furthermore, violence against women, especially the one perpetrated inside the homes, can have long-standing impacts and multi-generational impacts. What we see is children who grew in violent households are much more likely to be both victims and perpetrators of violence in adulthood. For all those reasons, we believe that women need to be at the center of discussions on violence prevention. As Pathfinders, as Madame Esambo mentioned, we manage the GenSec, the Gender Equality Network for Small Arms Control. We have seen remarkable progress in this area. Our members in Latin America, for example, have made great advances to the work of parliamentarians in the region to rethink legislation on small arms and ensure they take into account the devastating impact that firearms have on women in the region. Sorry. Later today, we'll hear more from our experts who talk about other manifestations of violence. Please. Another critical component of our report is the cost of violence. As we have said before, violence, even that which happens outside of conflict and that doesn't result in military spendings or loss of infrastructure, is still incredibly expensive. According to the Global Peace Index, interpersonal violence cost the world $2.6 trillion in 2022. While it's undeniable that a human life is priceless and that we cannot quantify the emotional toll and suffering that violence causes, we can try to calculate economic impacts, and that can be important advocacy too. In this report, we explore some of the ways in which this calculation can be made, including by going over some of the costs that need to take into account. Those are tangible and intangible costs, and can include costs related to incarceration, hospitalization, persecution, loss of productivity, loss of salary, and others. We want to commend 3 of our co-chairs, Switzerland, Costa Rica, and South Africa, for opening the doors and letting us put this methodology to the test and conducting in-depth costing studies in their countries. What we found, as mentioned by Ambassador Stillhart, is that even in a country like Switzerland that is rightfully heralded as a place of peace, over 8% of its GDP is consumed by violence, with much of this being associated with intimate partner violence. Assessing the cost of violence allows you to say, without a doubt, that beyond the more imperative to reduce violence, governments have an economic incentive to do so, and that it is more efficient to prevent violence than to deal with the cost it generates. Now I turn back to Daniel, who will talk about what can be done to prevent and reduce it.
Thank you, Louisa, for reviewing those findings. And it's against this concerning backdrop that I want to turn to the bright side of all of this, which is that we know that violence is preventable, and we've seen initiatives at all levels produce impressive results in reducing violence. As you've already heard mentioned through our work with the Peace in Our Cities network, we've seen reductions of upwards of 60% or higher in rates of violence in our member cities. And all stakeholders can and need to have a role in these efforts. We've identified 3 interrelated themes in the most promising of interventions. They target specific at-risk places and people. Secondly, they invest in changing norms and behaviors surrounding violence. And thirdly, we've seen that the most effective strategies are the ones that work across levels and across sectors. And we were pleased to find numerous examples of interventions that have produced measurable results in reducing violence, and notably at relatively low costs, especially when compared to the costs of violence that Louisa just described. The report goes into detail on many of these solutions at multiple levels. There's a small chart in the executive summary that you all have, and there's a much greater list in the report itself. But just to share a few short examples, at the individual and family level, we see psychology and counseling-based interventions have often been quite effective. This includes providing counseling services to couples and families to either prevent or respond to violence, as well as cognitive behavioral therapy for individuals who have been involved with violence. Moving up to the community level, we see a mix of successful interventions that seek to change how communities approach violence. They oftentimes mix both a combination of law enforcement with community outreach and seek to break violent cycles. They also invest as hotspots as part of larger development efforts. This includes specific examples like Cure Violence in Chicago. It's known in Chicago, but it's been successful in many different contexts. It uses violence interrupters from the community to break cycles of violence. There's focused deterrence, which uses targeted law enforcement and community outreach to bring violence levels down long enough to bring in other services. And a range of programs that invest in ensuring places suffering from higher rates of violence have the social services and infrastructure that they need. This includes things like installing lighting and turning vacant lots into parks. At the national level, and to a certain extent, the regional and international level, we also see examples of effective measures. Sometimes this involves restrictions or legislations on things that exacerbate violence. I'll note that two items that surface again and again in the studies that we've conducted relate to gun and alcohol sales. And oftentimes those measures, when properly targeted, are quick and extremely cost-effective ways to bring an almost immediate reduction in violence. Other legal reforms have been similarly impactful. In some cases, this has meant simply closing gaps and loopholes. Laws surrounding intimate partner violence are an area where gaps often exist, and sometimes simply closing those gaps results in an immediate reduction of violence afterwards. Police reform is one area where there is mixed evidence of its effectiveness, but the report does discuss how community-oriented policing can be effective when combined with other interventions. Also of note, law enforcement only approaches or heavy-handed approaches we have seen, if anything, have a counterproductive effect, especially when applied in a vacuum. We also outline how putting people at the center of justice and making justice mechanisms responsible to people's needs is a key violence reduction mechanism in itself. There are some examples of this in the report, and it's also work that's being done by the Pathfinders Justice team that has many other examples. And then we finish the report with recommendations to a wide range of stakeholders on steps to accelerate progress. I won't list them all now, and on the slides, we've highlighted just one example at each level. But to briefly review a few of them, for local governments, we recognize that cities play a critically important role in innovating and scaling solutions. And we want to highlight the importance of creating integrated, localized violence reduction strategies and establishing centralized offices of violence prevention, or OVPs, which can coordinate the activities of these strategies and bring multiple sectors together. For national governments, there's a need to support the collection of good disaggregated data on a wide range of violence forms, as well as underlying factors, to advance legislation to close loopholes, especially which those frequently occur, which, as I mentioned, oftentimes relate to firearms, alcohol sales, and intimate partner violence. And a critical tool that we think should be more robustly utilized is that of nationally led prevention strategies. We have a whole section on that in the report, and we're pleased to have Ms. Céline Monnier, an expert on the topic, joining us today to discuss this during the panel. For ministries of foreign affairs, government representation at multilateral institutions, we do recommend increasing direct support to local actors for community-led interventions and considering interpersonal violence reduction to be a core component of their SDG-related work. And it should include efforts to break down internal silos and promote cross-sector collaboration. Similarly, for multilateral institutions and bilateral development agencies, in addition to providing financial and technical support to the different measures, programs, and interventions that we reused, we would strongly recommend that country strategies accounts for violence prevention and reduction in all contexts, not just for quote-unquote fragile states. And finally, we have a section on the emerging role of the private sector in interpersonal violence reduction. This includes key steps that companies can take, whether it's small and mid-sized businesses creating, joining, or supporting community coalition violence reduction programs and efforts, and hiring practices that can provide economic opportunities to those who are at risk, as well as the efforts from large businesses that, due to their sheer size, are able to have an impact directly through their operations, including an example we've seen is violence awareness and support programs directly with their own employees and supplies and distribution changes. And with that said, we do see a need for a more robust framework on private sector engagement on interpersonal violence reduction, akin to the business and human rights principles, or as seen with business and conflict. In addition to that, I just want to mention a few more generalized recommendations that work across levels and that stakeholders should take into consideration, in addition to the three that were previously mentioned. We'd already mentioned that most interventions are multi-sectoral, target at-risk places, and try to change norms. But successful violence reduction strategies also have to be holistic, addressing the root causes of violence, recognizing, of course, that prevention is more effective than reduction. And there also needs to be a sense of urgency to seize the opportunity to obtain quick wins, like those mentioned in some of the examples of the report, without losing sight of the structural changes described that are needed for lasting improvements. I'm going to stop here since I know we're anxious to get to the next portion of the event. which I expect will be an excellent discussion with our expert panel that's here with us today. And a chance to take your questions afterwards. The questions can be directed both to Louisa and myself, as well as to the members of our panel. But that was just a brief overview on a very high level of some of the findings and recommendations from the report. But we hope that you'll take the time to read it, reach out to us with questions. We want to engage with all of you, and we believe that collaboration and partnership are essential in this effort. So on that note, I look forward to continuing our work on the task force and with all of you as we look to make our goal of having global violence a reality. I will now turn it back to Ambassador Kimani, who I believe will send us off to a short break before we resume.
Thank you very much, Daniel. It's now 9 minutes past 3, so we're running about 9 minutes late, but I shall not begrudge. We need the full 15-minute break from a human rights perspective. And the Davos-style, I want to change, if you see the schedule, it says Davos-style expert panel. I'm going to remove the word expert. We're used to this word, and I'm going to call them political engineers. Because political engineering is the world's most important job. No other engineering can exist without political engineers doing their job. And so we'll be joined here by some of the leading political engineers. And I will ask them as they're having their coffee to think in engineering terms about how to have global violence. How do we need to restructure state responses? How do we need to weave this into the machinery of multilateral institutions? What new tools we need that we don't have? The other day I met somebody who said, people get trapped in always seeking solutions that fit the tools that they already have. So our engineers need to help us to see, do we need to build new tools? And I hope that's a kind of discussion we'll come back to have. So it's now 3:10, and at 3:25, let's please take our seats together. Thank you.
Thank you.
And to also discuss the problem that we're dealing with. The only one of them who'll be using a microphone is Alex, who is the coordinator prevention of violence team at the World Health Organization. He has something that makes he'll need a microphone for today, but I think the rest of them will be okay. So here we have, if you can just give a little wave when I mention your name, we have Dr. Mark Downs, Director, Small Arms Survey. We have Dr. Angela May, Chief of the Research and Trend Analysis Branch of UNODC. I hope I did not mispronounce your name too much.
Yeah.
We have Dr. Keith Krause, Director, Center on Conflict Development and Peace Building at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Dr. Alexander Bouchard, Coordinator, Prevention of Violence Team at the WHO. We have my colleague, Celine Mounier, who's the Acting Director, Prevention, Peace Building and Protracted Crisis at CIC, who is Swiss via New York City. And Mr. Antonio Sampaio, Thematic Lead on Cities and Illicit Economies, Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. I am sorry to be looming over you, but Daniel had me on a little seat over here, and I was going to be literally looking at your knees. So I thought it's better to look at your top of your head than at your knees. So we have, it's 3:30, and I think if we can have a 45-minute discussion, and then we can interact with the audience, both online and here live. So I just want to open the floor to you and really get a sense from you what struck you the most in reading this report, struck you the most in terms of the findings, in terms of where you think it could go to, and how perhaps it impacts your own work. Where does this report get to you? So the floor is open. Mark, you want to take a first stab at it?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd like to just say that as the Small Arms Survey, we're very pleased to be part of the Halving Global Violence Task Force. And we were able to contribute a guest chapter to the report itself and co-host today's event. And my colleague, Julia Yadina, who's in the audience today, wrote that chapter on behalf of the survey. And so I'd also like to acknowledge her contribution. I mean, looking at the report, I mean, I think there are a number of key issues that really come out. And obviously we look at it from the perspective of violence reduction and looking at the perspective of small arms control as well. And a number of the statistics has been highlighted already, but I'd like to maybe just highlight one which really jumped out at me when we're looking at our global violent deaths database from 2021. 500,000 people died violently, and 260,000 of those died as a result of a firearm. And for us, then the link between reducing interpersonal violence and linking this to small arms control, I think is a key issue, looking at issues of diversion, looking at issues around control, the illicit trade of firearms and ammunition is key. I would probably say the second point I would make, and the report comes up also looking at the economic impact, and the figure I think was 2.6 trillion looking at the economic impact. And here again, I would kind of lean on work that we've been doing recently in the Caribbean to really underline this challenge, and the link also between, from our perspective, small arms control and development. What we found working with the countries of the Caribbean was that the cost of dealing with a single gunshot wound was between 2 and 11 times the GDP spending per capita on health. And as a result of this finding, the governments of the Caribbean in April 2023 actually recognized armed violence as a public health crisis. And I think that level of political recognition of the impact of violence, and in this case, armed violence, on development was key for their next phase, which is the development of a regional action plan to tackle this issue. Because really, if you're spending between 2 and 11 times your GDP spending on health for a single gunshot wound, it means that your ability to invest in other development issues, be it health, education, infrastructure, is severely limited by this pandemic of violence. And so being able to focus and reduce this allows you as a government to be able to invest in your population's future and be able to invest in sustainable development. So a number of other issues, but I'll given the time, bring in others, and I'll come back again maybe.
Thank you very much. I was going, and I'm not going, please feel free to interact with each other. But I was very struck by the public health approach that you talked about in terms of the Caribbean countries making this decision. Dr. Bouchard, WHO, would you see it that way? Does it appear to you to be something that belongs in the public health realm, or are we perhaps stretching that too far?
Well, Louisa.
The microphone in the room is a bit complicated to operate.
Let me try. Can you hear me? Maybe we don't. Louisa.
Yeah.
Louisa. Right. Well, there's a fantastic feeling of deja vu to be in this room to start answering your question. In 2002, WHO launched the World Report on Violence and Health, the foreword of which was by Nelson Mandela, and it set out precisely why violence should be addressed as a public health problem, and indeed focused intensively upon interpersonal violence for precisely the reasons that have been so clearly set out today and in the full report. So we really welcome this new report as a powerful new addition to an old story, but one that has not percolated deep enough and far enough into national, regional, and global policy. So, reflecting upon the report in the context of ongoing violence prevention efforts, I'd like to point to four balances that I think we need to get better. First, the balance between measuring the problem, how many homicides, how much rape, how much intimate partner violence, and measuring solutions. We're doing far too little to measure what countries are bringing to the solution side of the coin. If we can measure that better, we can hold countries more accountable for what they are, or more importantly, aren't doing by way of evidence-based interventions. And as a case in point, WHO is currently preparing the second global status report on preventing violence against children for publication in 2025. The second balance has to do with the distribution of outcome evaluation studies between the individual, the family levels, and the community, and most importantly, societal levels. There is a lot at individual and community level for obvious reasons, much easier. We have very few studies at the population level. However, we know from wealthy countries that you can demonstrate long-term downward trends. We're seeing a trickle of information on that from African countries. The large surveys have been repeated twice or more, but we really need to amp up the emphasis on population and municipal level outcome evaluation measurements. They're not going to be studies. It's often going to be just monitoring trends. Third, I really think there is a huge need to get a better gender balance. While boys and men constitute almost all homicide victims and are the perpetrators of almost all violence, at least in the political context that I work, all I hear about is violence against women and girls, which is good, which is great. But if the global violence agenda is to be accelerated, we really need to bring the focus on male-focused prevention efforts up in order to reach parity with the efforts to address violence against women and girls. Fourth, the question of specific subgroups versus addressing interpersonal violence as a whole. We heard earlier that there are several SDG targets. In particular, there are targets on violence against women and girls and violence against children, around which very vigorous networks have grown, and they have led to those areas pushing forward rather well. 16.1 is the only target that really looks at interpersonal violence as a whole, and I don't think it's achieved yet the kind of forward movement that there is for women and girls. And I see this whole global task force to halve violence, interpersonal violence, as a critical resource to remedy that and bring the interpersonal violence in as it should be, as an umbrella under which to address other types. I'm going to end by mentioning that the first ever global ministerial conference on ending violence against children is going to take place in Bogota, Colombia, on the 7th and the 8th of November this year. It's hosted by the governments of Colombia and Sweden, with support from UNICEF, the UN Special Representative on Violence Against Children, and WHO. And while it's going to focus on children and adolescents, that childhood violence is a major risk factor for subsequent involvement across the lifespan in all forms of violence, means that it's utterly relevant to everything we are discussing here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I find that so illuminating and promising in terms of future directions. Dr. Angela Mayer, you are an analyst working for an organization with a worldwide coverage of violence and criminality. What are you seeing in this report that dovetails with the important work UNODC does?
Thank you, and thank you to the Pathfinder for involving us. And as it was said earlier, we have really contributed a lot with the data that we have, and so particularly homicide. And one of the things that strike us also as an organization that we have been repeatedly saying is that there are different typology of violence, and if we want to prevent violence, we need to recognize which one, because a different typology of violence require different type of prevention action. And I think before, and many of the speakers earlier have mentioned a lot about interpersonal violence, where clearly there are issues of culture, stigma that require also long-term solution. And we see it in all data. We see it almost everywhere. The femicide, every year now we estimate the level of femicide in the world and regionally, etc. And we see how it's so difficult to change, even going up or going down. And so because it's really rooted in something that, it's hard to change overnight. But there are different other type of violence, and maybe that I would like to bring up because this is something that we work also on as an organization, that is, we in UNODC, we distinguish three big typology: interpersonal, so where you have domestic violence and the violence against children related to the domestic sphere, etc. And then we have organized crime-related violence, and particularly organized crime, that I wanted to emphasize, maybe to say a few words on that. And then we have social and political violence. And so we needed to, if we want to think about halving violence, we need to think about cross, and asking whether some of this violence are actually maybe easier to change in the short term. With a lot of questions on how actually we can do that. The country that reduced lately by, the country that managed to reduce the level of homicide, globally, the highest reduction is El Salvador. And so in El Salvador, how they reduce violence is, basically putting in prison more than 70,000 people with like a security measures. So to expedite, if you want, these measures. I don't want to judge, I think on the measure per se, but that is a question. But then these measures reduce very quickly violence. And if you speak to the people in El Salvador that re-elected the president, mostly also for this action, is that they feel safer. And I think that is something that needs to, as a community of thinking about violence, needs us to reflect. Not, again, I don't want to judge on the solution, but it's something that we need to reflect. And most also, in terms of organized crime, what is needed to prevent the organized crime is a lot more systematic and more in relation to thinking about displacement rather than replacement. Often, what we have seen with homicide, with organized crime, is that action to reduce violence, they don't really reduce, they displace somewhere else. It could be displaced within a country or displaced in another country, and we see all displacing the type of violence. We have seen, for example, in Mexico, in the 10, 15 years ago, when the government started to go against organized crime groups and that triggered violence, and then the violence translated into violence within groups. So these are all questions that I think we just need to, I wanted to add to the discussion so that we don't forget. Then there is an old part on social and political that has another big agenda to discuss. So I'll leave it.
Thank you so much. To any of you who are budding politicians or any political person listening to us, making people feel safe is a great vote winner. So Dr. Krause, you asked to speak.
No, I didn't ask, but I will. Also, Angela stole one of my first points. Okay. So I'll start with a different one. And there are some reflections in the report that I think are really interesting, and I'm eager to see how you will follow up on them. And there's others that I think we should stop and look hard at and decide how to pursue them. And one of them is the emphasis on calculating the costs of violence. And I recall several years ago with your WHO colleague, actually, Claudia Garcia Moreno and Charlotte Watson, a number of women who'd worked on sexual and gender-based violence. And one of them, at the end of the workshop, said, you know, we have all the cost estimates we need. We've been promoting them for years, and they don't actually get anything done. So I'm not so sure that estimating the cost of violence, despite all the interesting intricacies that go into that calculation, including for Switzerland, as I read that report, will actually give us the leverage that is needed to drive policy forward. So that's my first reflection that I think we all think about. The second, which is on the positive side, is your first recommendation, which is target investments and programs to specific at-risk places and people, which sort of corresponds to the kind of secondary prevention. Not quite, but in the way in which public health people think about that. And that speaks to the urban level mostly, and the local level, not so much the national level, because violence actually is distributed very unevenly across contexts, within states, within cities, within other environments. And I think that actually, therefore, we need to pick the scale at which we intervene. And I think that's going to be crucial to developing this agenda further. If you want to implement that first recommendation, how are you going to do it? And there are examples, illustrations for violence observatories and living labs. There's one that was launched in Montreal just a year ago to bring together the diverse stakeholders to work on that. So this is a casting forward a little bit. I haven't quite been around as long as Alex on this issue, and I do remember the 2002 report, but I do think that a lot of what we know about what works is based on knowledge that's been collected for a while, and we need to get, I think, some more evidence, not just at the national or population level, as you would put it, but what kind of initiatives are scalable and what kind of initiatives might be transferable out of context, and what kind of initiatives are very contingent on precise or very limited scope conditions or enablers. Because sometimes when you try and transfer something, you realize the context was so sufficiently different that it actually doesn't work at all. So scalability, transferability, and context are going to be really important moving forward. The point that you stole was the one about politics, which UNODC doesn't usually want to talk about. So that's impressive. But state violence is not part of this picture. But also the state as an institution that's failing to provide basic security. I don't know what the clearance rate for homicide is in every country in Central America, but it hovers perilously close to zero. So of course, the climate of impunity, committing a murder or any other act of violence is so high that the incentives for violent actors are very profound. I mean, why would you not use violence if you will go unpunished in all of these contexts? So there's also what the state does, which creates the conditions for violence, and what the state doesn't do. And I think putting politics back in this will help us also see why we have managed to achieve certain things and why we haven't. Because SDG 16 was, if I recall, the hardest goal to negotiate. Some people in the room might have been here for that. It's the last one to put in place. It was not an accident because violence is efficient and effective for certain actors. And unless we know how to tackle that a little bit head on, we can't just sort of be pious about kind of things that might work in certain contexts. So there's a few provocations based on what I think is a rich report that I hope we can carry forward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Krause. I'll ask you a question that you can answer later if it's okay. Because I was looking at your profile and you've been looking at the global burden of armed violence, armed groups, the way the international system works. Can you perhaps later map what are the incentives and approaches that would allow a financing of the agenda to halve global violence? What is it that we can drive? How can we shape this agenda so that treasuries can open up miraculously and checks can rain down on practitioners?
Setting me up for failure.
Researchers, because if we can come out of this short discussion with a real sense of, okay, if we approach this way, we may have some promising territory to go into that politicians who are willing to get into. It would really be of great value. Celine, you've been seeing this report being produced. Where do you see it coming from a perspective of prevention and peace building?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. And so thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be in this panel. I was really excited to read that report. I think it does a great job at summarizing what works. And it's good to see something a little bit hopeful in this current context, particularly. I was especially happy to see a reference to national prevention strategies, which has been a big focus of my work for the past few years. I work in New York, as you mentioned earlier, as you can hear at my very thick American accent. And so the work of my program has been to engage with diplomats. So we try to support the Secretary General prevention agenda. And we've been engaging with diplomats to try to understand a little bit what are some of the pushbacks against the prevention agenda. And there are three main pushbacks that keep coming up in the conversation. And we really think that those can be addressed by the United Nations focusing more on national prevention strategies. So I'll go through them briefly. So the first pushback that we keep hearing is that I don't want to say that I'm doing prevention because prevention is stigmatizing. And so if I say I'm doing conflict prevention, that means that I'm at risk of conflict. And this is definitely not an image that I want to be giving internationally. I think focusing on national prevention strategy is a way to address this issue by saying, no, prevention is actually something that is universal. If we look at what countries are doing across all income levels and across all regions, they are trying to do prevention, and we see many of those examples in the report. And also it's really important to invest as early as possible, because what we know is one of the biggest predictor of violence is violence itself. So once it's started, it's really difficult to stop. So doing early prevention in peaceful time is really important. The second pushback that we keep hearing is, oh, prevention is interference. And I think here again, national prevention strategy is a way to go around that and to say, no, actually effective prevention is something that is anchored in local and national inclusive ownership. And the reason why is because, as we see also in the report highlighted, there's a lot of different risk factors and root causes for violence, and they need to be addressed at all levels. And for instance, you mentioned violence against children. It's a big predictor of people becoming more violent or victim of violence in the future. So in our household, we need to come into doing violence prevention. And from the very household level to the national level, and that's where you were talking about the different levels of society, we need to commit to doing that violence prevention efforts as a society. And I think this is what national prevention strategy is helping us do, is connecting those different levels. And so it's the opposite of intervention, is actually really based on commitment and seeing the benefits of doing it. And the last point, and actually that's an argument that comes from even member states that are in favor of the prevention agenda, is saying, but what does that actually mean in practice? We keep talking about that, but how do you implement it? And I think when we talk about national prevention strategy, that really gives us the opportunity to go more to that practical explanation of what we are doing. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand those risk factors for violence. We understand that violence is multi-causal, so our solution needs to be a system of efforts of connecting those different responses. So I'm going to stop here.
Thank you so much, Celine. Now we come last, at least in this round, but not least, to Mr. Antonio Sampaio, who is an expert on urban warfare, urban violence, and happens to be studying at my old alma mater, King's College London. An excellent school, if I may say so. So, Antonio, I mean, you're writing papers for NATO, you're looking at your IISS. You've been working within the box of state security operations. Here we are on interpersonal violence. How does it strike you? Is it a complete departure from where we should be heading?
Well, I asked this question a lot because I worked for 10 years at this think tank called International Institute for Strategic Studies, which is very defense and geopolitical in character. And I now lead a program on urban violence and security at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And one of the things that struck me in the report is the widespread mention and sort of overlapping of issues related to local violence and how the local sphere, sometimes urban, sometimes local, is important for both the drivers of violence and the reduction of violence. And part of the reason is that I wrote the piece that talks a lot about local, but I was also struck by how commonly it appears in other sections of this report. And it comes at a moment in which the discussion that I used to have when I was sort of state-oriented and geopolitics came to dominate the discussion on international security to such an extent and it started with the annexation of Crimea by Russia. And since then, the discussion on security, on peace, on world peace became bifurcated. And states and national governments and ministries, they have tended to discuss security and peace as being very state-oriented, and the world of geopolitics became very even more important than before. And I feel that it is ironic and a bit sad that a report such as this and many other reports that we've worked on, including the Peace in Our Cities initiative that Daniel mentioned, show that global violence is predominantly or to a large extent urban and non-conflict based in character, and even in conflict areas. My research, for instance, in my PhD focuses on how urban areas are affected indirectly by conflict through war economies, extortion, drugs, and other conflict economies. So this bifurcation means that whereas in I have a leg in academia and a leg on policy. I dare say I have a leg on policy, although this leg is a bit, I'm trying to understand where exactly the policy world sits on these issues. But, and whereas in academia, in the expert world, there's been a boom in research on urban and local aspects of violence and subnational, the importance of the subnational level to look at the local level for understanding the drivers, the mechanisms, and the consequences of violence. In the policy world, in terms of the multilateral sector, especially, there's been a reduction in attention to these issues. And I commend the people in this room and Switzerland and CIC for raising these issues and trying to raise these issues and coordinate these issues at the global level. What the consequences of this bifurcation in our understanding of security and peace, I think it is related to an old concept that that war and armed conflict threatens the national governments, and crime and subnational aspects of violence, what they call low intensity violence, tends to be internal affairs of states, which is true. However, I was discussing this with one of my colleagues earlier. There are many examples of the multilateral sector working to coordinate and build constructive approaches to issues that happen inside states. So let's say in the area that I tend to study, housing, UN Habitat is working on housing all the time, and it's a very internal affair. But there is, and the other example is climate and the consequences of climate change and, coastal communities and resilience, which all happen inside states. But it's something that the multilateral sector and us in academia and whatever the policy-oriented research sort of is called these days, the NGOs and the think tanks, can help in bringing coordination, can bring sharing lessons on best practices, data. This is where we need to catch up with academia and bring the experts to discuss these better approaches. And I'll finish by pointing out the very political and governance aspects of violence and organized crime. Whereas what I referred before to the sense that, it's conflict and war that have political implications and threaten national governments, and crime is a matter of internal affairs, internal, communities, is very local. It's not for the multilateral system. One of the benefits of having this boom in academic research and data on urban aspects of violence and conflict is that actually there are very significant impacts of local urban violence to broader stability, even to democracy, because there are many areas in cities, even in large democratic countries like the one I'm originally from, Brazil, that are governed by actors that are not the elected democratic government. So, in the city that where I did my undergraduate and I spent 10 years there, Rio de Janeiro, the second largest city of one of the world's largest democracies, there are areas that are governed by gangs, and many thousands, perhaps millions, are governed, live in a system that is unresponsive to them and is sort of authoritarian or semi-authoritarian. So these political implications of the local, even though they are local, they deserve to be addressed in a more coherent way. The price of not addressing them in a coherent, coordinated way and discussing that at high levels is that local and national governments remain disparate and remain attempting policies that are proven not to work. So going back to the issue of El Salvador and mass incarceration and securitized approaches, which is working at the moment, but the data has comprehensively and systematically pointed to that not working the middle to long terms. So this type of high-level coordination, political will to achieve a more cohesive and more holistic approach to security is what I think efforts such as these and this report and the multilateral organizations' attention to armed violence, criminal violence, and urban violence can bring to the table.
Thank you so much. I mean, when we look at, it's been very interesting just hearing the different perspectives, and I'm sure there's so much more that you can all do to respond to this report. But perhaps if you don't mind me pulling and pushing and encouraging you to the parts of operationalization that you can see immediately. Obviously, like when I was thinking as Antonio, you were talking, and I was thinking of the costs of gun violence in the United States on the insurance industry, just paying for those hospital bills, the aftermath of victims of gun violence in the years after they have been shot, the impact on earnings, etc. And so I was wondering, could insurance companies invest in anti-gang activities, youth programs? Would this help manage their costs? Do they do that or don't they? How can we drive empowered actors, whether it's companies or governments at the federal level or at a city level, to embrace the findings of this report and push SDG 16 forward? Please.
So my effort to answer your very good question is triggered by Celine's comment that governments see prevention as interference. Maybe you can tell us more about that after I've said why I want to pick on that. All public health interventions are interference with a capital I. We interfere with the ability of people to buy alcohol, to smoke cigarettes, to avoid drinking water with stuff in it. Every single intervention in public health is massively interfering. What we need to do is make sure that people and governments, sorry, fluoride in the water. I'm getting my public health 101. We need to normalize violence prevention by pointing to these parallels with other public health interventions. There is nothing special, and I'm going to focus it very much on interpersonal violence when you look at it in relation to these other interference-sensitive issues in public health. I think the minute you step out of the interpersonal to the collective or the gang stuff or the stuff that's related to crime, it becomes more difficult. But there's a big sway that is readily sensitive and can be moved by this. I also think that the phrase risky places and people needs to have added to it products, people, products, and places. The big products being alcohol, guns, and drugs. So that's my take.
Public health approach gets us to intervene without hesitation because it is a public health problem. This is very European view. if we were sitting in Florida now.
I'm from South Africa.
Wow.
And I worked on the effort to get in place the Gun Control Act in the early 2000s and measure it. We saved 4,500 lives in the 5 biggest cities over the 7 years that the Gun Control Act was being implemented.
Dr. Krause had challenged you.
So I went away and did my homework.
Yes.
And I have sort of messages at 2 levels. The first, I can't quite figure out why over the past decade or so, the case for violence being a development disabler hasn't been taken up in, and I'm looking at USDC, in development agencies. Some have, and obviously the support for this work is important, but most major donors have committed to investing a significant portion of their money in conflict-affected and fragile settings. And the principal characteristic of what we would call fragile settings is high levels of insecurity and violence, not just conflict. So, so I think that working that through even further to make the case for why, and make the business case for why development investments ought to be not just conflict sensitive, but also sensitive to violence and insecurity in all of its forms, will be helpful. We know from the OECD and from aid data and other things that the investments in those areas that are actually focusing on violence prevention reduction are very, very small. So money is being directed to conflict affected and fragile states, but it isn't being done differently to take account of I think, the drivers of violence and insecurity. So at that level, I think that's not going to make checks fall from heaven, but I think there's a dialogue to be had. And I want to illustrate that on a second level with some very local things. I was at a very interesting gang workshop last week, where El Salvador came up, by the way, and every expert in the room said, yes, there's a short-term reduction in violence, and in 5 years after these people graduate from the University of Crime, that is the prisons represent, there will be an uptake in violence. So you've got a short-term gain, and you would agree with that, I think, with a very high long-term cost. But what they also said was that obviously the costs of these punitive incarceration policies, mano duro in terms of policing and cost of prison, are actually very high. And the cost of alternative policies to deal with gangs that are much more at the social level. Not all gangs are violent. Gang members don't stay in for life. They usually leave at some point. They can be encouraged to leave. There's a whole set of other incentives. And if you understand the sociology of the gang, and the participants and the incentives to bring in, you can actually develop not just soft policies to treat them as nice people, because they're not all nice people, but that are cost effective and that are much more so than mano duro policies. So I'm channeling what I learned from them, but I think that also is at that level where we can think about effective financing, quote unquote, unlocking and making the business case. Insurance companies aren't going to buy this. Because a lot of the people who are victims of perpetrators of violence are precisely the marginal people in society who nobody cares about. And the difference between a victim and a perpetrator is often who shot first. And so the private sector doesn't see them as a market, doesn't see them as grievable life, to use Judith Butler, to be honest about that. And so we have to confront that too, that people are excluded from this conversation and deliberately so by political elites.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
You had something? Yes, please.
I mean, I agree very much with Keith that it's hard to sell this at the moment, I think, to the private sector, but I do think we can do more to make this a political issue within countries themselves. And this is where I do think actually costing out the impact of violence, the economic impact of violence, even though there's questions maybe around how to do it, is actually important to be able to make the case to invest in violence reduction. But to do this, I think we need a number of things. One is, I think we need to understand what are the key drivers of violence and what are the issues of the demand for weapons, for example. and understanding, if we don't understand properly the demand for weapons, tackling only the supply lines of the illicit trade will not deal with the issue. And to come back to your point on products, I think one of the key developments we're seeing now is the democratization of the development of weapons. We've seen 3D printing, we've seen different forms of weapons outside of the formal manufacture. And for those of us who were at the UN POA meeting 2 weeks ago, it was a really important point to be able to look at these new technologies and look at the guidance that can be provided to states, the legislation that's required to limit them, because, and this is where data is really important. A lot of the countries were saying that these aren't significant issues, but if you look at the data that we've been able to look at, it's in the Netherlands, 40% of the seizures are converted firearms today. In Quebec, I think it was 14% of the seizures were 3D printed weapons. And so we're seeing these new technologies democratizing the ability of people to use arms as part of violence. Another point, if I could come back to, and this is on the point, in terms of the fact that armed violence is a gendered phenomenon, and if we look purely at deaths, this is just a tip of the iceberg. When it comes to understanding violence and the impact of violence. Weapons are used as a facilitator for gender-based violence, used as a facilitator for organized crime, used as a facilitator for terrorism. And so that's only give us a part of the picture. And understanding what is below the water in terms of the long-term impact you mentioned, Ambassador, it's really key, I think, to look at the broader impacts, even though it may not lead to a lethal outcome, the long-term impact on the individual is significant. And this is where weapons can be seen as a facilitator of these other forms of violence.
Dr. Mayer?
Yeah, no, I was trying to think about your clever questions on how to operationalize and how do we empower actors. And I go back to what you, Kate, something that made me think when you say violence is instrumental. And so when it becomes instrumental to someone, there is no incentive to reduce it. And so how do we empower actors to have a violence not instrumental to their objective? And I think, and here you mentioned also this divide on the development actors, for example, and how do we convince development actors to invest also in violence prevention? The biggest violence prevention, there is, again, sorry to repeat, there is the interpersonal violence, but definitely is more linked to development than other forms of violence. Because the other forms of violence, everything is relating to development, but there are components more relating to the rule of law, to impunity that was mentioned earlier, and the geopolitical aspects, for the social. And so, but how do we empower those actors, the actors in conflict? Because, we have, we know now how gray is the area between conflict violence and non-conflict, armed groups, you mentioned in the DRC, armed groups, for example, militias in the Middle East. I mean, however we call groups, there is really this gray line between conflict and non-conflict. And so how do we give the incentives to those actors not to act with violence and to pursue their political agenda without violence? And that is very easy to say and very hard to think. But then that translates into how do we mainstream this idea of reducing non-conflict violence in conflict prevention and in the conflict agenda? How do we mainstream reduction of violence in the development agenda, not just providing development with the hope that in the long run, but also to see how to reduce those other forms of violence that at the end actually undermine development. One of the things, for example, this is not related to violence, but just to give you an example, one of the things we find very difficult is to go to the environmental community and explain why crimes related to environment affect their objective. For example, and that has been difficult indeed with the development of the community conflict agenda. And so But the other thing that we need to think in this is that to make sure that there is not displacement of the problem. And I'm talking about, for example, violence, physical violence. And there is also debate in the research and policy community. I'm thinking about organized crime. And organized crime can operate in a much maybe more harmful way to communities without violence. And so it's something, and organized crime is underestimated for this because everybody thinks that organized crime existing only where there is violence. But organized crime is empowering, particularly where it's not violent. And then it comes out in Sweden. I mean, we spoke about Switzerland in terms of interpersonal violence. In Sweden, gangs violence, or organized crime, however you wanted to call it, because it has operated under the radar for many years. And so we need to think about, how we break that equilibrium. And one thing that it was said, I think, from Daniel, when he presented the results of the report, to say unilateral law enforcement action is not productive, and definitely it's not. And but then how do we combine? So the solution cannot leave criminal justice out, cannot leave law enforcement. It has to be a combination of public health, development, law enforcement, criminal justice response has to have really all of the actors. So in a way, in making sure that we empower all actors to see that violence is not into their objective.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sampaio.
So I'll go back to the issue of the private sector, which is often involved, especially in Latin America. I want to make a point about the state and governments. I think that often the development practitioners, international development practitioners, donors, and to some extent the private sector, they tend to want to bypass the state or governments because they suspect them for good reason. But there is no going around the fact that we need to improve the state and improve governance in order to have large-scale impact. So I was discussing this in two very different contexts, one in Afghanistan and the other in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. In Afghanistan, I was talking to an NGO worker at a session of the, can I mention the think tank CIPRI in Stockholm a while ago, and he was talking about an initiative to help people build wells in communities. And we were talking, why don't they improve the piped water system instead of having to teach the communities to dig wells for themselves? And one of the reasons is that whoever donor that didn't trust the local government to do that, and there's the danger of corruption, and in Rio we had very different but in the same category of problem, which is the fact that Rio became, and there are very positive aspects of that, became a laboratory for NGO work, and a lot of that is supported by the private sector, by Brazilian companies, some exterior companies as well, and foreign governments. But what we've seen over decades of doing that is that the effects tend to become very localized, and the only initiative that really led to a temporary but large-scale improvement in governance and in security in Rio de Janeiro was a program called the Pacification Strategy that tried to change the approach of policing towards a more community-oriented approach, at the same time that development and public services sort of use that temporary truce to go there and do. We've discussed this, including with Keith Krauss in the room, the several negative aspects of the pacification that later deteriorated, but it is a massive effort to include the state and to improve the agents of governance to be able to scale up these initiatives. But because without them, the NGO efforts, the positive, inspiring examples will remain local. So we need to bring the state and improve it so that we build that trust, and then those positive elements can have the political backup to be expanded and scaled up.
Thank you. Celine?
Yeah, I feel I've been challenged to talk about intervention, so
Interference.
interference, intervention, both actually. So just I'm speaking in a context where I'm working in New York, so we have the Security Council. So I think the response to your question is twofold. The first one is saying we want to stay as far as possible from the Security Council because we don't want that kind of intervention or interference. The second, I think, is speaking more about the type of programs that international actors develop when they go in country, right? So you're talking about public health, which is also really a model that I appreciate for violence prevention. And we know that certain things are evidence-based, like we know that this is some specific risk factors are linked to violence. But for instance, in public health, we know that smoking is probably not really good for you. We know that not exercising is not really good for you. Having high level of inequality is not really good for violence. Not having access to justice is not very good. But I think one of the problems that we also hear from countries, from governments, from civil society is that international actors have the tendency to come with their own program and start implementing them without acknowledging that there's already a system of efforts that exist in the country. So we really need intervention or intervention and prevention that are both evidence-based for sure. And I think I very much agree with you that we keep making the same mistakes because we don't know what works and what doesn't work. But we also need to understand what is already being done in countries that is actually addressing the root causes of violence. And sometimes those are actually not called prevention at all. And you need to be able to identify them and connect them into a system of effort. So I think it's really this double approach, which is context specific and evidence-based. And I think very often we have one without the other, which is one of the big issue. And then to your very challenging question of what do we do with the implementation of the reports, maybe a few things that I think are really useful in this report. I think first is we need to strengthen the political will and the social commitment in country to be doing prevention. We need to be selling prevention constantly. And I think this report is really helpful to give some of those arguments. And I hear you that costing violence doesn't work in all contexts, but I do think that in some contexts it may work. And I think we have a lot of diversity of actors. I think they're not going to respond to the same arguments, but I think the more arguments that we have, the more we're able to choose which one to use behind closed door to raise awareness about the importance of prevention. And I think the second aspect that is really important that this report highlights a lot is evidence of what works. And that goes back to your question. We keep making the same mistakes. We have been making those same mistakes for years and years and years. So I think having good practices and having a good example is really a way to be able to give that information to national and local actors so they can use it to adapt that to their context, if that makes sense. So I think that would be.
Well, now we'll come to the audience, but I have to say with a light touch that one of the things that happens when you stop being a permanent representative in New York is they take your car away. And you now go into the subway. And this is what you do every day. And in New York City today, the chances are that if you are assaulted on the subway, you'll be assaulted by someone who has a profound mental health illness, who has not, in a city whose mental health services have broken down, and the police are the major interveners on mental health crisis rather than mental health professionals. And so the person, it also correlates greatly with homelessness, and the person is not taking their medicine and has access to certain illicit drugs. And the combination leads to a subway that has more and more assaults. So I think just as my little contribution, and think Dr. Bouchard here, having mental health responses. After COVID, we discovered people were in a lot of crisis. And even in New York, one of the world's richest cities, it's very difficult getting mental health support. It's costly, it's not available, much less the rest of the world. So perhaps the mental health systems can respond in ways that sharply lower interpersonal violence. Antonio, Brazil with Bolsa Familia, Lula's great visionary program. Last year, it had 21 million beneficiaries. I wonder, what has Bolsa Familia done in terms of the data on interpersonal violence at the family level, because cash transfer has effects that are measurable. I think we need to look into that. But over to you, dear audience, those of you who are online and those of you who are here, please feel free not just to ask questions, but to offer what is your idea of how we can drive this forward? How can we save lives? Please, go ahead.
Do I need a microphone?
Yeah, please introduce yourself and
Great. No, thank you to our finders and all the panelists today. So my name is Ned. I'm working for an organization here called the Association for the Prevention of Torture, APT. So of course, one of the key things we work on is quite specific. It's on prevention of torture. By torture, we go by the UN Convention Against Torture definition of torture. And of course, thinking I'd like to hear a little bit more about one of the messages we try and put forward as part of the government buy-in is how an ineffective criminal justice system also leads to all the negative wider societal impacts. So I'm quite interested in panel. I mean, I'm mindful of what Dr. May and Dr. Krause has said already about the classic tough on crime stance, and how actually there is data that shows it results in a higher prevalence of interpersonal violence. But I suppose just to, as well as the representatives of the task force, if there's more about the data on this, where we work to prevent the risks of where public officials can, in positions of heightened risks where torture occurs. We'd love to hear more about other initiatives and organizations and the data that you hold. We can also put forward, because I think I'm here today because I think for us, we see an correlation as well between the prevalence of torture by state officials and the wider societal impact on the global occurrence of torture violence. Very long question.
Thank you very much. I want to invite Mr. Peter Batchelor, who is a member of this task force and a practitioner of long-standing experience, did some work in Cape Town, amongst many other places. Peter, perhaps you can respond to what you've heard from the panel.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. It feels like we're gathering again after 20 years of collectively working on these topics. But, great kudos to the team from CRC in New York. It was a great pleasure to be part of the task force, and it's lovely to be here today. I wanted to pick up on a few points. I think on the issue of interpersonal violence. I mean, I think the public health approach has always been seen as a very strong and multidimensional approach to dealing with interpersonal violence. But as you mentioned, this requires a long-term societal approach to dealing with these things. And that's something where we can perhaps make the linkage with some of the national prevention strategies, I think. That offers maybe a new vehicle for thinking about how we develop national prevention strategies that have a strong focus on dealing with interpersonal violence, including domestic violence. The bigger challenge is the organized crime and the social and political violence. And here we used to talk about the political economy of violence. And I think it's kind of gone out of fashion a little bit, yet probably as we look around the world today, it's probably more in fashion than it's ever been. And that's a really difficult thing to deal with, because governments in many contexts, including my own country, South Africa, have a lot of interests in maintaining the political economy of violence for their own personal interests, but also party political interests. Many parties are funded these days through organized crime. And so the political economy of violence is actually, extremely powerful in many of these societies. And that raises a real challenge for the international community. Because how do we as the international community address those issues of the political economy of violence? And that's the point I think, Keith, you and others have mentioned around why is it that the development actors, particularly the multilateral banks and the IFIs, have kind of focused a lot on crisis and fragility and conflict, but very little on violence and justice and security. And so maybe it's time to bring that perspective, and the report does a good job of showing this, of bringing that sort of political economy of violence reduction back into development strategies. One of the problems I think we've seen in the last decade or so is that, as we all know, the rising humanitarian crises and the humanitarian caseload has actually created huge challenges for ODA. If you look at where ODA is going these days, increasing amounts of ODA are going to deal with the ever-growing, and the STC colleagues know this very well, the pressure on the global humanitarian budget is at an all-time high. And so there are big trade-offs now with development financing that could have been used for violence prevention strategies or more mainstream development work that doesn't bring that perspective into it. To give you an example, I used to work in Myanmar, as some of you know. I was there during the days before the military regime took over in 2021, and many of the bilateral donors had huge bilateral development programs on health and education and many other very important developmental issues, but there wasn't a perspective on actually bringing a violence prevention agenda into those development activities, despite the fact that Burma, or Myanmar as it's now called, has had the longest running civil war of any country in the world. And so there was a kind of blind spot often in terms of thinking about how do we address violence in society that is so endemic, and as we see now, post-military coup, it continues. And yet there's no conversation anymore about development with a violence prevention or a violence reduction perspective. We're now stuck in a humanitarian track, which is very difficult. So those would be some of the questions I think we should bring back into the conversation. And the report, I think, gives us a good basis for doing that. Thank you.
Peter, thank you so much. I don't have the pleasure of knowing you personally, but I want to thank you so much for the role you've played in the production of this report. We're really grateful. Annika Norberg, who works in this very building, would you like to take the floor?
Wonderful, thank you so much. I wanted to first of all commend the co-authors and organizers of this. I'm just the person who set up my hand to pose a question, that's why I'm speaking. No credit, I have no ownership of this, but I really wanted to commend. It's a very comprehensive and insightful and of course very timely and informative report. I was a little bit surprised. It's the first session I think I've been to in the past year that the new agenda for peace or the summit of the future and so on has not been mentioned neither in the content or in the panelists. So kudos to you.
This is a good thing. This is a good thing.
It highlights how timely this conversation is and how focused it is on the content and the substance. And of course, I can't help, therefore, but still put a challenge to the panelists that we have both the Summit of the Future, Back for the Future coming up, and the Peace Building Architecture Review 2025 as being the key issue. So one key recommendation finding in the report with each of the panelists at some point during the conversation, would you like to see being put to the member states that need to be acted upon? And I really think it's a fantastic report and study and really important. And I do believe that the statistics shared really also brings the attention of those that are not already convinced to realize it's important. And the final thing is also, as I was listening about the El Salvadorian case being Swedish, that was my first thinking. Like in Sweden, we had the opposites. In 2015, a total avalanche in gang violence and transnational organized crime, and the system, our governing system, is very slow to pick up on what do we need to address it. And if it's not addressed in a way, so maybe El Salvador has gone that way and Sweden's gone that way. So I think a case study, comparative case study in 5 years, as Keith was suggesting, will be really, really helpful. Sorry, that was a bit lengthy, but congratulations, everybody.
That's fine. As we are closing, I want to encourage some of the younger members of the audience. Please speak up. Let's hear your perspective, whether you're a student or a young professional. There are young Kenyans on the streets now in Kenya, and they have said we have not been listening, and have become conscious about we have to listen, we have to hear your perspective. So whether you're online or you're here and you consider yourself a young person, as I do myself, please speak up. Antonio, you want to?
I feel young as well, believe it or not. But I wanted to respond precisely on the Summit of the Future. And one of the reasons I'm working actively with some partners, especially the Peace in Our Cities and CIC is part of that, to raise awareness to the issue of urbanization as a key issue for the future. Because it's actually in the Pathfinders report that in 2007 we crossed the threshold of half of the world population living in cities, and we took how many centuries and thousands of years to reach that point, and then just in 2050 we're going to cross another threshold, which is 2/3 of people living in cities. And whereas that agenda, and I've been talking to a lot of people in this weird policy world that I'm still trying to understand who is our target audience for that message. And one of the target audiences is the people who are doing and discussing the Summit of the Future, is that there is no consumer audience in the multilateral sector for us to discuss these lessons, this booming research that I mentioned, this data that is coming from the expert community on what works, what are the drivers, what are the mechanisms of violence in cities, and the specificity of urban violence in terms of, whereas violence happens in all environments and urban violence is not more important than other things, there are specific mechanisms in cities, and it is the type of organization, the type of human community that is increasingly where the human population lives. And there are elements in that system that are specific to the way that violence operates. So the way that certain communities and informal settlements are governed, the way that public services are provided, and that interferes in the way that violence is conducted, and the types of violent actors that control urban communities. So we need to think more of how we break up these the work and the prevention work on violence and security from the geopolitical arena to the local level. And I think that will be crucial in bringing young people, because their experiences with violence and with insecurity, I would think, are predominantly at the local level in terms of their neighborhoods, the areas around where they live, and working more with them on that will speak more directly to their needs.
Thank you. Daniel?
Yes, and Louise and I will be up here as well to field questions for the report as well as with the panel. But one thing I wanted to respond to that's come up is your excellent question about repressive approaches that you asked, and especially when it's law enforcement heavy, when it's incarceration heavy, or even potentially torture related. And absolutely something that's discussed in the report and we see quite a bit of is, yes, you will see that backlash in 5 years in a place like El Salvador, where it's repressive and heavy-handed. The problem is aligning the incentives, and that's what's so incredibly difficult, is to tell somebody who is afraid to leave their own home or is afraid within their own home what's going to happen to them today. That's something that will make their community safer today or tomorrow. But trust me, in 5 years, it will be worse, is a really hard message. Similarly to the politician who'll be out of office within 5 years. That's the term limit. And how do you align those incentives? And part of what requires the holistic approach, it's not that there's a single silver bullet, sorry for that analogy, but a single answer to that, but it's part of where we see the private sector. And that's part of what we've talked about in the role of the private sector. We've seen scenarios where they can provide that continuity across administrations and sometimes take that long-term view. And I hate to put it in these raw economic terms, but a community where people cannot leave their homes is not a community where you're going to see thriving business. It's where employees can't show up to work. It's where consumers don't have money to spend. It's where they're not able to access stores. And when that is made clear, we have seen how private sector, through their own advocacy, through their own engagement, through their lobbying with elected leaders, have both the political influence to be able to advocate for more long-term measures beyond something like a mano dura, as well as that long-term view. Private sectors will invest in infrastructure projects and investments that they know won't pay dividends for 5, 10, 15 years. violence reduction can be part of that. We have seen limited examples of that, but it is one potential area that we think is ripe for expansion.
Thank you, Daniel. Is there any question from online? Not yet. I can start.
If you have some questions.
In the meantime, I see a hand up here. Yes, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mathilde Boda. I work for also the World Health Organization, like Alex. I'm the technical lead for the Global Health and Peace Initiative, and I originally come from the peace building sector. I wanted to share two thoughts or information here. First, picking up on one of the last points that was made on the panel about the link between mental health response and violence prevention. Maybe some good news, at least at policy level. First, in 2020, during the Peace Building Architecture Review, as some of you might know, there's been some strong advocacy effort towards linking peace building and mental health and psychosocial support, which did lead to some tangible outcome, at least again at policy level and to another extent operational level, which is first some guidance on how to link mental health and psychosocial support and peace building, done by UNDP and by the ISC, which is the Global Humanitarian Forum, as most of you know, for coordination. So there's this, and I hear there might even be a working group or a task force, whatever the name is, on MHPSS and peace building being set up, which I think is some good news. It shows we're moving in the right direction, and WHO and their partners and our partners have been already working towards linking MHPSS and peace building in many different countries, in Sri Lanka, in Somalia, in Cameroon, and many others. And related to that, the second good news, as I've heard, indeed, our colleague reminding us here that the humanitarian caseload having raised so much. The good news on that here is that the World Health Assembly has recently adopted a resolution or a decision requesting emergency response to systematically include mental health and psychosocial support being part of those responses. So that's another good news. And in the Global Health and Peace Initiative, we're definitely pushing hard towards implementing this new direction, this new approach. That's one. And second, I wanted to share some thoughts with you, rather now from my peace building experience in the field, especially when I was leading Interpeace's program in Ivory Coast, working with gangs, conducting research on violence, prevention of extreme violence, the French translation. Anyway, you got it. There was a sense in our research findings and our work with gangs in Abidjan. There's something that's very important, but that's so intangible that is not often being mentioned and recognized in operational work, which is the importance of youth need for belonging to a group and the fundamental need of the youth to also be able to relate to some form of authority and some positive adult models. And in our work, working with the education sector, with schools, high schools, working with adult leaders in their communities, et cetera, we realized that it was extremely important to bring them to a point where they could find an alternative to joining a violent group, for feeling they could exist, and for finding adult guidance in their life path. And with WHO as well, in fact, in Cameroon, working with former Boko Haram members and the health sector, we've tried with IOM to reintegrate those former gang members or former Boko Haram members by giving them a positive opportunity, which was in this case health community surveillance, because then they have an identity, a positive one, they belong to a group, they have adults leading them and training them and monitoring their work and helping them out. And it's so important, but it's not often as recognized as it could be, I believe. Maybe in the DDR sector, it's a bit more discussed and examined. but maybe not as much in the broader peace building and violence prevention efforts. I was thinking. So just wanted to share those thoughts, and also exciting news, because we don't often have positive news to share. So
thank you so much. It's true. All positive news is very welcome nowadays. We have 3 questions from our online audience. We're supposed to be finishing about now. We're running a minute over, but I see in the schedule they gave me a whole 15 minutes to preach as a closing address. So I'll reduce that to 3 or 4 minutes. So we will still be able to finish at 5 and then go for our reception. But the questions, and I'll read them as they are. One is from Anantha Krishnan, and I'm addressing them to the panel. Anantha Krishnan asks, in a country like Haiti, the root causes and historical factors of violence and gang violence in particular are addressed with policing from foreign countries such as Kenya.
Ambassador.
Yes. I used to be an ambassador. I can feel the sensitivity. A country that itself is witnessing violence due to disempowered youth. What role do communities and neighborhoods play in addressing the endemic nature of violence? That's the first question. What role can communities and neighborhoods play? And then the second question is by Amjad Chatila, who's a diplomacy coordinator at Every Woman Treaty. How can the international community further bring in to the conversation the new forms of violence against women and girls, such as cybercrime and gender apartheid? And then finally, a namesake who's also an old friend called Razia Kimani, who's a peace and security advisor, who's a peace and security advisory, who says, thank you for the discussion and efforts to tangibly reduce global violence. I wonder whether the research went into structural violence and how it contributes to some of the mental health challenges and types of violence like interpersonal violence that have been mentioned. And if we haven't included it, Daniel, she suggests it would be critical to look at forms of structural violence. And perhaps this is also a comment on sort of intersectional types of analysis of violence. So let me come to the panel with those 3 questions and perhaps give you also an opportunity in 30 seconds or 1 minute to give your closing thoughts before we get to our cocktails.
So I'll have a go at the question about structural violence. It's a term that was coined many years back, and I think today we tend not to use it. We tend instead to talk about the social determinants of health, the social determinants of human capital, social capital, which is a way of not, as it were, accusing a state that has high levels of economic and social inequality of being a perpetrator of violence, but perhaps acknowledging that they are struggling with these major macro social issues around redistribution of wealth, power, etc., etc. Because no country wants to be told at the outset that it is a perpetrator of structural violence. And yes, structural factors are hugely determinant of interpersonal violence. In fact, of all the many health issues that have been correlated with things like economic and social inequality, both homicide and non-fatal interpersonal violence are far more sensitive to these than, for instance, cardiovascular disease, depression, or anxiety. Well, they're all related. Yes, the mental health point is a big one. Over.
Celine?
No, thank you. Maybe I would like to address 2 questions, one of Mathilde and then one of the Summit for the Future, which is glad to be taking a break from, but I think we're back. I think the point that you raised earlier about many of the risk factors being really overlooked, such as the need for belonging, the need for authority. I think also the need for status. I think there's a lot of risk factors that are constantly being forgotten because it's very difficult to look across disciplines. So many people are going to tell you it's all political, or then it's all the economy, or then it's all mental health. And it's very difficult to have that vision across the different fields. But I think this is what makes prevention effective. And I think this is what they're highlighting in the report. We need multi-level, cross-sectoral approaches, because those root causes are actually interlinked. So sometimes to make the political change, you need to address the underlying mental health and psychosocial issues. So I think this is just to highlight that this is a very important point, and I'm very grateful that there is progress on image PSS in that regard. And then to go back to your question on the Back to the Future, which is a General Assembly resolution, and the upcoming Peace Building Architecture Review, which is going to be a General Assembly and the Security Council resolution. I think the questions is what isn't covered by other processes that we need to address through those two processes. And I think there are 3 points that for me are particularly important. One is we need to destigmatize prevention. So I think having the focus on national prevention strategy can go a long way to put that back on the table and to have more support from member states. The second, and we have a very fragmented United Nations system, and it's very difficult for national and local actors to get the support that they need, even when they want to. So even when we have the political and social commitment in country, we're missing opportunity to help those countries because they can't access the need that they. So I think it's really important to use also those resolution to start having this conversation. For instance, to my knowledge, there is no agenda item at the General Assembly that covers all forms of violence, prevention of all forms of violence. So where are we having those conversation? And I think the third point is talking about what do we mean when we talk about national prevention strategy. And it's extremely difficult to get to any definition at the time. And I think it shouldn't be a political exercise, but it should be something that is based on what works. So what works if we decompose their principles? And I think you can see it in this report, and it's highlighted in the conclusion section. There are principles, and we know what works in violence prevention. And I think it's important to have those principles somewhere in a resolution so we can start having a shared understanding of what we're trying to achieve.
Thank you. Dr. May?
I want to answer the question on 80. And that was a question on, the role of a community and neighbors. Clearly, they have a key role, but they need to be helped. Alone, they are not going to make it. Not only in Haiti, but in many other communities that are hijacked by, the organized crime gangs and groups, etc. And then on the question, I think it was very interesting that it was bring up the cybercrime that we haven't discussed. This is a completely different forms of violence that probably we don't know a lot as compared to the rest, but that's also where to bring an element that goes beyond national prevention strategy, because that's where cybercrime with many of the elements of the geopolitical violence and also organized crime violence is transnational. And, and where I would hope to see in the summit of the future, but also in the agenda for peace is that element. That is not only conflict that we need to prevent, but it's that transnational dimension where countries need to be together. And that's where I feel I would like to see. I don't think we will, but that's to conclude. I think I want to say, first of all, because I don't think I said it at the beginning, and really congratulate you for the report. And I have to say, I'm personally honored to have been, just providing some data and maybe some advisor, but also as an organization. It's something that we will use. And I think it's important to have in the report also, to document things that work. But I go back to what, Keith, I think you said at the beginning. I hope, and I fully take also what it was said in the panel before, to say now we need to operationalize. But I hope that we don't stop because we don't have enough evidence to really also understand, to help, how do we stay in between the criminal justice of Sweden with the criminal justice of El Salvador? Where is that we can find element, what really works in those difficult circumstances? And I give an example, and I think, if anybody has a good advice to the president of Ecuador today, and I don't think, now I speak as a researcher, I think we need to build more of evidence to advise the type of Ecuador's president that they need advice and evidence from research today.
Dr. Kraus, and then
Very quickly, almost telegraphically, I think we can move a little bit away from a fuzzy concept of structural violence and tackle your question of torture by using the idea of violence as violation of fundamental and basic rights, and I mean that in the largest sense. And that's part of what I think drives perpetrators and what we see as gang violence or criminal violence, other things, is a sense of violation, even if it's things such as honor and dignity that drives a lot of people to perpetrate violence. We know that from various studies. The second and very small point I'd make is a violent act is at the end of a very long chain of causes, some indirect, some direct. And finding disruptors, ways of breaking that chain, some things as simple as streetlights or alcohol sales, etc., or interventions at a very local level with perpetrators is a good way. So rather than thinking about this as blanket and prevention in the large scale sense, prevention as disruption of the chain is going to be, quote, cost effective. And I agree, we need to think about the costs. I don't think the big macro level costs are helping us a lot, but we do need to know, like, it actually is severely costly for communities and societies and individuals. And if I had a last hashtag, David Lance isn't here before, isn't here, I think, but go local. I mean, I think the international, this is not a Geneva message, the international system is blocked. But let's go local, because there's a whole lot of good people and ideas that we can work with.
Thank you. Dr. Downs?
So what I would say to wrap up is, one of the key points I think that comes out of the report is that this requires a cross-sectional engagement. And I think this panel reflects that. You have people working on crime, people working on public health, people working on development, researchers, etc. And so none of us hold the key to solve this issue. It's too complex and it's too broad. But there are three, I think, key pillars that come out from the report for me. One is data and evidence-based policy. The second is service delivery at a state level, and especially in relation to security and justice. And then the third is this focus, and like what Peter said, how to integrate violence prevention into all of our policy. So armed violence reduction strategies, violence prevention strategies, how to have that lens in all of our development activities is absolutely key. But and here to make a plug for Geneva, I suppose, here we have the humanitarian, the public health, security actors, and I think the data specialists necessary to be able to help contribute to looking at what works and what we can do.
Thank you so much. I must say now, we have 1 minute. Okay. Let me just thank all of you. I'm supposed to sum up, but I think it's impossible and unfair to do so. But I will say I heard about the public health approach. I heard about development, the role of cities, the process of urbanization, how to engage on issues of organized crime, the political economy of violence. I keep hearing this phrase, political economy. Political economists are coming back, and not a moment too soon. And you cannot manage what you cannot measure. I wanted to just finish with the public health frame is very powerful. In fact, we heard about public health is an intervention, and a strong intervention that shapes communities fundamentally and people's lives fundamentally. And so experts are deeply tempted by all approaches that remove the politics from the table and make things about public health. We have to take the public health part, but we must not shy away from the political one, because ultimately we have to seize the imagination of political leaders, tie their political legacies to the work we hope to achieve. And that is a work of imagination and shaping and being incredibly political. This is why we cannot avoid politics. We cannot run around politics. We must face it at some point. So that's a big challenge to us. However, a reception awaits us. Going forward, there's going to be other launches of this report. We want to go to the African Union and engage the African Union to bring that out. The peace and security architecture of the African Union is about to undergo significant shifts in reaction to what's happening all over the continent. Perhaps this is an opportunity. We are going to hope to be at the Summit of the Future and have a panel on the sidelines of that very busy time. And we're looking to engage the development actors, the international financial institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, and engage them. And we're going to do all this with your awareness. We hope this is the beginning of a conversation, and that conversation will lead us to new forms of collaboration, new forms of invention. We may need to build new tools. We may need to repurpose existing tools. But at the end, the ball that we are keeping our eye on is the tangible efforts to reduce interpersonal and local forms of violence. And I think we can do a great deal together. Thank you so much. And now we will go to our reception. Daniel, where is it?
The reception will be, I believe, we call it petals, right? One petal over on the terrace. I believe it's on the 8th floor. Is that right? Perhaps Mark, you can.
So it's, yeah, pedal 6.
Oh, 6.
And then on the 8th floor.
The important question is, how do you get there?
Follow myself and Peter.
Join me in giving a big hand to the panel. To the audience here and the audience at home.